Act, standing in the name of Mr. Hsu.
Mr. Hsu, seconded by Mr. Dubourg, moves that Bill C-626, an act to amend the Statistics Act, appointment of Chief Statistician and Long-Form Census, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Industry, Science, and Technology. Debate, the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, as you may know, this debate has been rescheduled 3 times because of events out of our control over the last couple of weeks. And, you know, we're used to mixing up our schedules, but that also means that my family schedule has been rescheduled 3 times. And so I want to thank my family, staff, and volunteers for taking care of that. I also want to acknowledge my wife, who has volunteered quite a number of hours on this project. And I want to acknowledge the outpouring of support from across the country that we've heard from in the last little while. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to present my private member's bill C-626, a bill that reflects the belief that a people must have trustworthy information about themselves in order to govern themselves wisely. Indeed, the Prime Minister himself said in his recent speech to the United Nations, "Vital statistics are critical. You can't manage what you can't measure." We parliamentarians should aspire to safeguard the integrity and quality of fundamental information about the people of Canada whom we endeavour to serve. Is that not what we seek when we pray at the beginning of each day in the House of Commons? Grant us wisdom, knowledge, and understanding to preserve the blessings of this country for the benefit of all and to make good laws and wise decisions. However, the quality of national statistics has been compromised. In 2011, the voluntary National Household Survey replaced the long-form census. Researchers have publicly called that survey worthless. What are some of the effects? In May 2014, the progressive Conservative Premier of New Brunswick said that the elimination of the long-form census makes it hard to track the outcomes of the province's poverty program. That is, it is hard to figure out what New Brunswick got from the money spent to help the poor. National Household Survey data were too meaningless to be published for 25% of Canada's towns and cities because of low response rates, rising to 30% for Newfoundland and Labrador and 40% of Saskatchewan's towns and cities. All levels of government and the private sector have been handicapped by bad data here in Canada. What's worse is that the one mandatory long-form census forms an essential anchor that is needed to adjust for errors in many other voluntary surveys. We've lost that data anchor. Why is the voluntary National Household Survey so poor? The problem is that certain groups of people tended not to fill out the voluntary survey. Rural residents, single parents, one-person households, renters, the very rich, poor, younger people, they all tended not to complete the National Household Survey. The result is a biased and misleading picture of Canada and Canadians. This is what scientists call a systematic error. A systematic error, unlike a random error, cannot be corrected by sending out more census forms. But this systematic error is eliminated if everybody who receives a long-form survey fills it out. So not filling out the long-form census is a disservice to the country. That is why filling out the census should be considered a civic duty. In 2011, the government went ahead and sent out more voluntary surveys in order to compensate for the lower response rate. This inflated the cost of the census by approximately $20 million, but gave us poorer information. Avoiding such waste is another reason why we should restore the mandatory long-form census. But more importantly, making business and investment decisions, managing the Canadian economy and the affairs of the people all require trustworthy information about the people. That is why just this past summer, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce passed a policy resolution calling for the restoration of the mandatory long-form census. That is why in 2010, groups such as the Canadian Association for Business Economics, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, the Conference Board of Canada, and the Toronto Board of Trade opposed the elimination of the mandatory long-form census. Let me say this again. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Association for Business Economics, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Conference Board of Canada, and the Toronto Board of Trade want the mandatory long-form census. Let me give you an example of the value of the census. Suppose you want to know how educational attainment and income are related. You could get data on education from graduation records. You could get data on income levels from tax returns. But if you want to know how a person's education is related to their income, you have to ask persons both questions at the same time. You have to survey them. This sort of question is very important for provincial government policy, and that is why the provincial governments of Ontario and Quebec protested the elimination of the mandatory long-form census. Mr. Speaker, the government said in 2010 that it eliminated the long-form census because some people believe that it is an intrusion into personal privacy. In its final report on 2016 census options, Statistics Canada considered the use of a virtual census based on using administrative data the government collects in the course of normal operations and in other surveys. Indeed, some countries, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, managed to do this and have no census. In an interview with the Ottawa Citizen in August 2014, Chief Statistician Wayne Smith said, quote, "Could we actually, without bothering Canadians, be able to obtain the same level of accuracy or better than the current survey-based census? We're probably 2 censuses away before we could do it." So, is this the long-term plan of the Conservative government? Could it be that the government is only guilty of being too hasty in eliminating the long-form census before its replacement was ready to be implemented? The answer to that can be found in the same StatsCan report, which noted the following about the virtual census. Quote, "This approach requires both a population register and a universal personal identification number. Neither exists in Canada." What might life be like with such a universal personal identification number? It might be a number which it would be a number which you received at birth. You would use it for education, health care, driving or gun licenses, paying taxes, voting, reporting change of address, or banking. All your vital information could be in a single database, cataloged by the universal personal identification number. That's what happens in countries with no census. Most Canadians would agree with Statistics Canada that there are serious privacy issues with a virtual census. Letting Statistics Canada take a snapshot of you every 5 years, as it has done for decades, is not as risky as having all your vital information tethered for life to a universal government ID. For decades, Statistics Canada has done an excellent job of protecting the privacy of individual Canadians who fill out the long-form census. To summarize, the Conservative government knows that the long-form census is less of a threat to privacy than other national data gathering systems in use today. Bill C-626 also gives new responsibilities to the Chief Statistician so that the work of Statistics Canada is not unduly subject to the political imperatives of the day. In 2010, the Industry Minister claimed that Statistics Canada itself suggested the replacement of the long-form census with the voluntary survey, and that Statistics Canada and the Chief Statistician supported the government's move. In the wake of this statement, Chief Statistician Munir Sheikh resigned from his post, issuing a public statement explaining, quote, "I want to take this opportunity to comment on a technical statistical issue which has become the subject of media discussion. This relates to the question of whether a voluntary survey can become a substitute for a mandatory census. It cannot. Under the circumstances, I have tendered my resignation to the Prime Minister, end quote. Munir Sheikh later elaborated on his resignation, explaining that a critical issue was the fact that StatsCan was subject to significant interference from the government of the day. He has since gone on to say that, quote, in my mind, the most serious consequence of cancelling the census is the loss of trust in Statistics Canada to be independent of government interference. Bill C-626 seeks to protect the integrity of StatsCan so that Canadians can trust that their data is produced according to strict professional considerations, including scientific principles and professional ethics. In describing the duties of the Chief Statistician, Bill C-626 removes the phrase, quote, under the direction of the Minister, and instead requires the Chief Statistician to establish and publish guidelines in technical and methodological matters based on international best practices. Indeed, Canada helped codify some of these best practices in a document called the United Nations Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. The bill also gives the Chief Statistician the duty of educating the public, consulting stakeholders, and choosing census questions. Under Bill C-626, the Minister may give orders, and the Chief Statistician is still accountable to the Minister. But if those orders fall within the scope of technical or methodological guidelines, the orders must be published in the Canada Gazette. Because the Chief Statistician is granted additional duties and independence, Bill C-626 requires that he or she be chosen in a way that safeguards the credibility and integrity of the office. For that reason, the bill establishes a process similar to how officers of Parliament are chosen. There is extensive consultation with stakeholders by appointing a search committee composed of senior representatives of the civil service, the statistics profession, and the Canadian research community. There is also consultation with the leaders of all official parties in the House of Commons because the Chief Statistician should be credibly nonpartisan. Finally, Bill C-626 does not enshrine the latest form of the long-form census into law. Instead, it acknowledges and makes allowances for new sources of data or methods of data collection in the future, methods that must maintain or improve the quality of data but may be less intrusive or less costly, all while protecting people's privacy. And Bill C-626 eliminates the threat of a jail term for failing to truthfully answer the census, instead replacing it with a fine of at most $500. People who guard their privacy so much that they won't fill out the census will not face a jail term. I want to re-emphasize that Canada's mandatory long-form census is less of a risk to privacy than the national statistics systems of other countries who have no census and instead rely on administrative data tied together by a universal personal identification number. Data about Canadians is continually collected, analyzed, and stored by public and private organizations, probably more so than if the mandatory long-form census still existed. What's the difference? When Statistics Canada collects, analyzes, and stores data, it works very closely with the Privacy Commissioner. Statistics Canada is accountable to the public as it does its work through this elected House. With the mandatory long-form census, Canadians are, in a sense, getting the best information for the lowest cost in risk to privacy. I will end, Mr. Speaker, by talking about duty. As Canadians, we have a duty to ensure that Canada has the financial capacity to protect ourselves from foreign threats and to offer all of us equality of opportunity. Thus, we have a duty to pay taxes. As Canadians, we have a duty to ensure that our justice system is accepted by the people as legitimate and fair. And thus, we have a duty to serve on juries. As Canadians, we have a duty to ensure that trustworthy information is available, that we may govern ourselves wisely for the benefit of all. This is the duty to respond to the census. For the good of Canada, may responding to the long-form census again be recognized as a civic duty. May this House vote to approve Bill C-626 at second reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Prince George, Peace River.
Mr. Speaker, honourable colleagues, thank you. I rise today to speak to Bill 6.
Order. Sorry, we are on sort of questions and comments there, but sorry for the miscue there, and we'll carry on. The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Cowichan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for bringing this very important private members' bill before the House. And I know that certainly on the New Democratic Party side, we'll be supporting the member's bill and getting it to committee. And, of course, when the government was in the process of cancelling the long-form census, we fought hard against that decision. And I wonder if the member could comment on what he sees as some of the implications that for policy making, both at the federal level but at the provincial and municipal level, what he sees as the implications for not having adequate data.
The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are many, many implications related to governments of all levels, municipal, provincial, and federal, not knowing about the people that they are supposed to be protecting and taking care of. In Kingston, for example, the whole north end of Kingston, which is a lower income area of Kingston, all the data there about education level or Aboriginals or immigration levels or household income were suppressed because not enough people returned the National Household Survey. So when you don't know where the people are who need services, you have a harder time locating the services and determining how much the quantity of services that is needed to be delivered. And this repeats itself across the country, Mr. Speaker, but because it is the federal government that is abdicating its responsibility here.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Kingston and the Islands for his remarks here in the House today. He referenced the National Household Survey in a couple of parts of his remarks here today. I'm wondering if he could tell this House that survey provides much of the data that planners need for their public policy planning. He also referenced that some countries collect data through new or different means. I'm wondering if he could give some comments on the National Household Survey, perhaps learning from some of the international approaches beyond just the long form. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Well, there's two things that I would say. With regards to the National Household Survey, researchers who have analyzed the data have discovered that it is of very poor quality. And in fact, people looking at the income data revealed by the National Household Survey, because they were able to compare it with the tax data, have shown that it's, well, they've called it worthless. With respect to the planners, Mr. Speaker, actually, I would say planners, urban planners, are probably the most supportive group when it comes to the mandatory long-form census. And with respect to other countries, there are countries that I mentioned, 5 countries in Europe that do not have a census. They have a different system. The problem there is that everybody has this universal personal identification number. The Privacy Commissioner is dead set against that. There are definite privacy risks that Canadians, if we were to implement such a system, I would recommend, Mr. Speaker, that this country have a very serious discussion of the privacy implications, because I am not sure if Canadians would feel comfortable with that. And so the safest thing to do in terms of privacy is to continue what StatsCan has been doing for decades, and do a mandatory long-form census every 5 years. StatsCan works very closely with the Privacy Commissioner, and it's accountable to the public. As they do their work, as they ask questions and get information from people, StatsCan is accountable to the public. There's a lot of information gathering going on, Mr. Speaker, across this country that is not accountable to the public.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his efforts in putting together this bill. I think it's quite commendable. I recollect a few weeks ago a Globe and Mail editorial or a Globe and Mail article supporting the honourable member in this bill, and it seems to me it feeds a lot of other media commentary from pretty well right across the spectrum, left, right, up, down, whatever. That supports the honourable member's proposal. So I wonder whether he might give us some commentary on the media support that he's received for his his proposal.
Honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Yes, I was very happy to read a very, very strongly worded editorial in the Globe and Mail today supporting the restoration of the mandatory long-form census and denouncing the actions of this government 4 years ago. But I should mention that in that the writers of that editorial seemed to assume that this bill would fail and be voted down by the government. And so I offered to the government earlier in question period the possibility of a compromise where they could choose a couple of questions from the census that the people who thought the census was intrusive, the people most complained about. And we could have, I think researchers would be happy with this compromise if we could take out a couple of questions so the government could be happy. Maybe we could reach a compromise. I think that's the sort of thing that we in Parliament should be doing more of. And so when the government speaks, I hope they would perhaps take the time to address that idea.
And